Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Human Biology, Chapter 8, Part 9, and we are studying the muscles of the leg. So let's do a quick review of those. So we have first off, the gluteus maximus, which extends the thigh at the hip joint and rotates the thigh laterally. You've got the gluteus medius, which abducts the thigh at the hip joint and rotates the thigh medially. And then deep to that, the gluteus medius is the gluteus minimus, the iliotibial band, which stabilizes the knee and is a tendon, the psoas major that flexes the thigh at the hip joint, the adductor magnus that adducts the thigh at the hip joint and stabilizes the pelvis, the gracilis, which adducts the thigh and flexes the leg at the knee joint, the sartorius, which crosses the top of the thigh, flexes the thigh, rotates the thigh laterally at the hip, and rotates the lower leg medially at the knee, and helps you sit crisscross applesauce. And the hamstring muscle group, which is made out of 3 muscles that extend the thigh at the hip joint and flex the lower leg at the knee joint. And a lot of people have tight hamstrings. The quadriceps femoris, which flexes the thigh at the hip joint and extends the lower leg at the knee joint, and is actually 4 muscles, and you use it for basically everything. And then the lower leg, you have the tibialis anterior, which helps with dorsiflexing the foot and inversion of the foot. And on the calf, you have the gastrocnemius, which is involved in plantar flexion of the foot and flexion of the lower leg at the knee joint. And deep to that, the soleus, which is also involved in plantar flexion. And the Achilles tendon, which assists the gastrocnemius and the soleus in plantar flexion. And we talked about the fun fact is the Achilles tendon is named for the Greek god Achilles, who was like a human, so he was like not a god, but he was greater than a normal human. Anyhow, so as the story goes, his mom dipped him in the river Styx so that he would be immortal, but she held on to him by his heels so that he was invincible everywhere but where she held on to him, at his heels, which would be the Achilles tendon. And then during the fight at Troy, where the Trojan horse, all that stuff came from, where Paris shot an arrow that hit him in the Achilles tendon and killed him. So that is how the story goes. So if it's something that you're not good at, or it's like your weak spot, like, oh my gosh, my Achilles heel is like chips or something like that. Like it's gonna do me wrong. I'm gonna have a hard time with that type of thing. All right, so just a review of our muscles. We have our glutes, and then those hip flexors, like the psoas major as well, and your adductors, like the gracilis and the adductor magnus, and your abductors, like the sartorius here, and then the quadriceps and the hamstring muscle group, and the gastrocnemius and the soleus is a review of some of the muscles. So we have learned all 30 muscles. Good job. Now what could possibly go wrong? So what happens to the muscular system as we age? Well, there is a gradual loss of muscle cells, which makes the whole muscle smaller and less powerful. And so this happens at about age 40. So if you have fewer muscle cells, you are going to have a smaller muscle, and your muscle is going to be less powerful than it was before. What could I possibly do to avoid this? I'm over 40. That sounds like I don't want that to happen. Well, activity and exercise will delay how fast that happens and will decrease how much it happens. So atrophy occurs when you age, but also it can occur at any age. And what is atrophy? That is a decrease in muscle size when it's not used. So if you've ever worked out and then you stopped working out and those big muscles weren't so big anymore, that's what happened, was atrophy. Okay, let's talk about muscle injuries. So you have a strain versus a sprain, and if you want to do a T-chart, you could. So a strain is a muscle injury caused by the overuse or overstretching of a muscle. But a sprain is an injury caused by the abnormal joint movement, and it is more severe than a strain because there's been a tear in the ligament or the tendons of the joint itself. So usually have to ice it. So both of them can cause pain and stiffness and swelling. And then ice will help both of them, particularly the sprain. You want to get ice on right away to kind of help with the swelling, because you're probably going to have more swelling with the sprain because you have those little tendon and ligament tears. So nothing your body can't fix if it's a sprain. It probably will just hurt. Okay, so muscle ouchies, because they're not really injuries, but they're not really disorders, but something's going on. So we have a spasm versus a cramp, and if you want to do a different T-chart, you may. In a spasm, that is a sudden and involuntary muscle contraction. So I'm sure you've all had a muscle spasm before where it just kind of like, maybe your eyelid or something just like twitches. Whereas a cramp is strong and painful, and it just keeps going. So maybe you've had like a leg cramp where it's really hard for that to stop, and it just kind of gets tight and you really have to like massage that out. Okay, let's talk about some muscular disorders that also involve another part, an associated structure. So bursitis, so what would that mean? Well, it's inflammation of the bursa, which are those fluid-filled sacs that minimize friction between tissue and bone. So it's around joints, so around muscles and bones. So painful with swelling and restricted motion at the joint is what happens. That joint swells and you don't have as much movement at that joint as you had before. Bunions are actually a bursitis on the medial side of your big toe. So if you have a bunion, it is a bursitis in a very particular spot on the inside of your big toe, and that is from long-term pressure. And how you could avoid that is having really good shoes. So if you don't want ugly toes when you're old, you should make sure you wear good shoes. Okay, tendinitis. What is that? It is inflammation of a tendon, and it's usually due to overuse or overexertion. Some really common ones are shoulder tendinitis, the hamstring at the knee tendinitis, Achilles tendinitis. Those are some common ones people get. And then there's plantar fasciitis, which is actually a type of tendinitis of the plantar fascia, which is that thick band of connective tissue on the bottom of your foot. So you could probably feel that if you're not wearing shoes. There is a thick band of connective tissue, and that can get inflamed. All right, another disorder with associated structures is carpal tunnel syndrome, which I'm sure you've all heard of. That is an overuse injury and involves the tendons of the forearm flexor muscles. So the ones that flex, so these are going to extend and these are going to flex your wrist. And then those tendons in there have gotten injured and overused, and often the sheath where the nerve is going in and out has gotten injured and causes a lot of pain. Okay, shin splints, which probably a lot of you have had shin splints. That is an overuse injury along your tibia bone. And shin splints can be from a number of different things. It could be tendinitis of the tendon where your tibialis anterior muscle inserts up by your knee, kind of high on the tibia. It could be inflammation of the tibial periosteum, which is like the covering on that bone could be inflamed. Or it could be a stress fracture, like a little teeny fracture, a hairline fracture of your tibia bone itself. So there are a lot of different ways it could be. What causes this? It is caused by running on hard surfaces without correct shoe support and by weak or inflexible lower leg muscles. And so we can talk about some exercises you could do to avoid that, particularly if you are in track or cross country. Well, it's been a while. We need to catch up with Sue. So what happened to Sue? So we will talk about her multiple sclerosis in class. And then I do want you to write the summary down. We covered a lot, and so it's good to kind of refresh and have it all in one spot. Okay, we talked about the 3 types of muscle cells. We talked about the functions of muscles. We talked about the structure of muscle cells. We looked at a muscle cell contraction with the actin and the myosin and the sliding filament mechanism. We talked about exercise, the aerobic and resistance exercise and what happens to the muscles when you do that. We talked about attachments, so your origins and insertions. We talked about different types of motions like flexion, extension, adduction, abduction. We talked about how bones and muscles are levers and how they move. We talked about the muscles of the head and neck. So let's go back a little bit. So you've got your temporalis, masseter, zygomaticus major, and your sternocleidomastoideus. You've got your muscles of the arm, chest, and back. So you have your trapezius, you have your latissimus dorsi, you have your deltoid, you have your pectoralis major, you have your biceps brachii, you have your triceps brachii, you have your brachioradialis, you have your flexor carpi ulnaris. Then you have your chest and abdominal muscles. So you have your intercostals, your interior and exterior intercostals. You have your diaphragm. You have your abdominal muscles, the rectus abdominis, your external obliques, your internal obliques, your transversus abdominis, and that pelvic floor muscle group. And then you have your hip muscles, which would be your psoas major and the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius, and your leg muscles. So let's include the quadriceps femoris, your biceps brachii, your adductor magnus, your gracilis, that sartorius muscle, your lower leg muscles like the tibialis anterior and the gastrocnemius and the soleus, and not to forget your iliotibial band and your Achilles tendon. Somehow in that list I said biceps brachii instead of hamstrings, and obviously your biceps brachii is in your arm and your hamstrings are a leg muscle. And then we also talked about the disorders of the muscular system and what could go wrong. So your muscle unit is finished. Whew, hallelujah. Good job, everybody.